Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading Chapter 8 of Charities Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Myrtle was married after a 3 weeks engagement. It's old-fashioned to be engaged long, she told Charity when the girl commented upon the fact. Besides, I think it's just as well. It doesn't give you time to change your mind. Charity's dark eyes were full of wonder. My mother and father were engaged 3 years, she said. Myrtle made a grimace. Heavens, how perfectly awful! They must have hated the sight of one another. They were engaged on the quiet, Charity said thoughtfully, and my father's people all refused to have anything to do with them when they found out. Myrtle yawned. Like the real old-fashioned storybook, she said cynically. Mercifully, we've progressed since those days. I'm not so sure, Charity said wisely. She went on folding the piles of silken garments which covered Myrtle's bed. It was strange how the entire family seemed to realize Charity's usefulness when anything was required. During the past few days, she had been taken away from her work in the library to assist with Myrtle's wedding preparations. It was, Charity, do this. Charity, do that, all day long. Charity did not mind. It was wonderful how she had become resigned to her aunt's autocratic ways and to Myrtle's exactions. After all, they keep me, she told herself when she felt like rebelling, and I suppose it might be worse. She was far more excited about the wedding than Myrtle was. I've never been to a real wedding like this, she told her cousin, pausing in her work for a moment to give utterance to the many thoughts seething in her mind. And, oh, won't you look just lovely coming up the aisle in that white frock? I don't wonder Mr. Pelham loves you. Myrtle laughed. Do you think he does? She asked cynically. I would not like to stake my immortal soul on the fact. Charity looked puzzled. If he doesn't love you, why does he want to marry you? She asked. Myrtle shrugged her slim shoulders and lit a cigarette. He thinks I'm presentable, I suppose. She laughed at her cousin's amazement. My dear child, when you're as old as I am, you won't be so romantic. There's nothing ideal about my marriage, and don't you imagine it. Richard has been in love with heaps of other girls in his life, and I'm perfectly well aware of the fact. Don't you mind? Charity gasped. Mind? Why should I? I've been in love with heaps of other men, too. Oh, how horrid! Charity said in a pained little voice. She really thought it was. She had been taught by her father that love was the most wonderful and sacred thing in life, and she had imagined that like the prince and princess in all the fairy stories, one knew at first meeting that love had come, and that from thenceforth everything was plain sailing and unalloyed happiness. She was painfully beginning to realize that her ideas needed readjustment. Here was Myrtle looking an ideal fairy princess, and uttering hard, cynical words which seemed to shatter the beauty and romance of everything. Charity sighed and went on with her task. Anyway, I don't believe it's always like this, she declared. Don't be silly, Myrtle answered, and walked out of the room. And 2 days later she was married. It was a blustering February day, with fitful showers every now and then, which drenched the world and made Charity shiver in the thin, entirely new frock which, in a moment of unusual generosity, Mrs. Atfield had allowed her to choose. It was of pale primrose silk, made very simply, and Charity looked quaintly attractive as she stole into the big London church and slipped into one of the back pews where she could see everything without being in the least conspicuous. She had never seen so many beautiful women in her life, and as she watched wide-eyed while the church rapidly filled, Harvey, very smart in an immaculate tailcoat and gray trousers, caught her eye as he ushered the guests into their seats and came across to her. You can't see there, he whispered. Come up in front. But Charity would not. I'd much rather stay here, she said. There was a look of admiration in his eyes which made her frown. She did not like Harvey, and she did not want his admiration. She made no reply when he told her to look out for him when they got back to the house. I like your frock, he said in an undertone as he hurried off again. Charity did not care whether he liked her frock or not, and she forgot all about him as soon as he had left her. There was a flutter of excitement when Richard Pelham and his best man arrived. 2 women in the pew behind Charity had a great deal to say about both men, and although Charity was shocked to think that they should talk so much in church, she found it impossible not to listen to what they were saying. Scraps of their conversation kept reaching her. Money, of course. Myrtle's mother always meant her to marry money. Well, I'm sorry for her. Everyone knows what Richard is. There was some scandal. Charity lost the rest, but her heart swelled with indignation. Why need they say such things even if they were true? She tried not to remember Heather's passionate outburst at the mention of Pelham's name. Poor Heather! She wondered if he knew what was happening today, and if so, how he felt. The bridesmaids arrived. They stood at the church entrance, shivering in their flimsy frocks, and carrying huge bouquets of Madonna lilies, tied with blue and silver ribbons. And once again, Charity lost sight of the underlying tragedy of it all in order to admire and wonder. Then came the bride. A real storybook bride she was, with her dainty frock and priceless lace veil turned back from her face and fastened with a coronet of orange blossom. Charity knew that the veil had been lent by somebody with a title, and that it was an heirloom. She wondered how many other brides had worn it before Myrtle, and if any of them had looked happier than she did. But for the touch of artificial color in her cheeks, Myrtle would have been as white as her bridal dress, and there was something set and hard in her pretty face as she walked up the aisle, that seemed to speak of a forced determination to go through with her share of the bargain, no matter what it cost her. She wore a pearl necklace which Pelham had sent her only that morning, and a shiver of apprehension swept through Charity's sensitive little soul as she remembered what she had been told of its value. It seemed to her like the price of her cousin's happiness, a chain which had been hung about her neck by the man who had bought her. Myrtle went up the aisle. Charity knew there had been several rehearsals of the procession, slowly and impressively on her father's arm, but Mr. Atfield looked grave and sad, although in the front pew his wife was all proud, triumphant, and smiles. Myrtle went up the aisle. Charity knew there had been several rehearsals of the procession, slowly and impressively on her father's arm, but Mr. Atfield looked grave and sad, although in the front pew his wife was all proud, triumphant smiles. This was her crowning achievement. She had snatched Richard Pelham from the grasp of a dozen other scheming mothers, and linked his money to her own depleted banking account. She had heard many of the rumored stories about him, but she chose to turn a deaf ear to them, whereas with Heather she had gladly welcomed anything in the least derogatory, and eagerly enlarged upon it. But then Heather had no money. The ceremony was fully choral. Everything was perfect, quite perfect, Charity heard people saying afterwards when they were all back at the house, and Myrtle and her husband were standing under an enormous bell of white flowers, shaking hands with everyone and receiving empty congratulations. So it was perfect outwardly, she was forced to admit. She heard a man, who she was told was the finest connoisseur of wine in London, declare that he had never tasted better champagne in his life. She heard people valuing the wedding presents at thousands of pounds, and yet, whenever she looked at Myrtle, with her set little smile and tragic eyes, she felt like bursting into tears. Why had she done it? Why? Charity kept away from everyone on the outskirts of the crowd. She longed to go to her cousin, but she was afraid, and she was thinking of stealing up to her room when Harvey came to her. "Haven't you had any champagne? Isn't anyone looking after you?" His face was flushed, and he took her arm with a familiar gesture. Charity wriggled free. "I've never tasted champagne, and I'm sure I should hate it," she protested, but he insisted on bringing her a glass, and made her drink it while he stood by. Charity screwed up her face. "Oh, isn't it queer?" she asked in amazement. "Do you good," he declared. "It's made your eyes sparkle already, you know." He lowered his voice. "There isn't a girl to touch you for looks in the whole show, Charity." Charity frowned, so that her dark eyes almost disappeared under her brows. "Don't talk such rubbish," she said sharply. "It's the truth," he insisted. "Bernard, he's best man, you know, said the same thing. He asked me to introduce him to you." Charity tilted up her chin. "Thank you. I don't want to know him." "Why not? He's got pots of money." "He's got a nasty face," Charity said bluntly. Harvey laughed. "You call a spade, don't you?" he answered. "I say, are you coming to the dance tonight?" "No." Charity knew that there was to be a dinner and dance at one of the smartest restaurants in London, but no invitation had been extended to her. Harvey looked annoyed. "Oh, I say, you must come. I'll tell the mater you are too." "I shan't come if you do." "Why not? I haven't got a proper frock, for one thing." "Myrtle's got dozens. She can lend you one." "Thank you. I can't dance." "I'll soon teach you." She looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't want you to teach me." He flushed, then laughed. "You're an artful little creature," he said fatuously. Who told you not to make yourself cheap?" Charity's eyes grew furious. I don't know what you mean, and, anyway, I don't want to talk to you," she said in a savage undertone. He caught her hand when she would have turned and left him. "Don't be a little fool, Charity. If you'd like to be friends with me, I can give you an awfully good time." "I don't want to be friends with you." "Why not?" Charity tore her hand from his. "I don't like you, that's why," she said, and slipped away from him into the crowd. Harvey scowled as he looked after her. He was a great success with women as a rule, and it angered him to be snubbed so determinedly by his cousin. "Confound it all! She owes everything to us," he told himself. Anyone would think she was a princess at least." Then he laughed and fetched another glass of champagne. No doubt it was just her artfulness. No doubt she discovered that the way to make most sure of a man was to avoid him. Well, he was content to bide his time. Myrtle had gone upstairs to change into her traveling dress. It was Charity who had laid out the dainty garments on the bed and slipped a knot of white heather amongst them for luck. "She'll want all the luck she can get, too, poor darling," was the thought in her mind as she waited at the top of the stairs, longing to go to Myrtle, and yet not liking to do so. Myrtle had so many friends around her today. Then suddenly the bedroom door opened and Mrs. Atfield came out. She was frowning and looked worried, but her face cleared a little when she saw Charity. "Oh, there you are," she said with a sigh of relief. "Myrtle wants you." She caught the girl's arm and held her back for a moment. "Be careful what you say to her, Charity. She seems a little upset. It's only natural, of course. The excitement of the past weeks has been too much for her. Be very careful what you say." "Yes." Charity knocked at Myrtle's door. There was a little silence, then, "Come in," she heard in a stifled voice. Myrtle was alone in the room. Her bridal gown lay in a forlorn heap on the bed, and she was ready dressed for her journey. Charity shut the door behind her. "Aunt Edith says you want me," she said timidly. Myrtle tried to speak. Her pale lips moved, but no words would come. Then suddenly she burst into tears. Charity was horrified. For a moment she stood petrified, not moving. Then she gave a little impulsive rush across the room. "Oh, don't cry, she said pityingly. She put her arms round Myrtle and hugged her as if they had been children together. She went on talking, trying to comfort her in her own quaint way. "Oh, don't cry, you beautiful thing. Please don't cry. Oh, I wish I could help you. I'd just love to see you live happily ever after. Oh, please don't cry on your wedding day. It's such a bad omen." For a moment Myrtle clung to her desperately. Then, with a great effort at self-control, she pushed her away. "I'm a fool. Why did you let me cry? I shall look a nice sight now." She was at the dressing table, dabbing at her eyes with a powder puff and sobbing all the while. "Is the door locked? No? Well, then lock it, or we shall have Mother or some of the others in. Please lock it." Charity obeyed. Her heart was breaking with compassion. It seemed a terrible thing to her that Myrtle, who was usually so cold and self-possessed, should be crying so helplessly. "We've only got a moment," Myrtle said, sobbing. "Just pour some cold water in the basin for me, will you? I must wash my face. I know I look dreadful. And listen, Charity, I can trust you, I know. And there's nobody else I can. I've had a letter from Mr. Heather." "Oh." Charity almost dropped the water jug in her agitation. "I found it in my room when he came back from church. He's been abroad. I hoped he was going to stay there." Her voice broke, but she quickly controlled it. "He's coming back. Today, I think, or tomorrow. And he says he must see me, that he has got something to tell me which may alter both our lives." She broke down again, and Charity stood with wide eyes and parted lips staring helplessly at her. And it's too late," she whispered. Myrtle laughed, and somehow the laugh sounded worse than her outburst of grief had done. "Yes, it's too late. It's like your favorite stories right up to the end, you see. Or do all your stories have happy endings? Well, it doesn't matter much anyway. I'm married, and that's all about it." A little shiver swept through her, and she looked at Charity with tragic eyes. "I daren't write to him. What can I say if I do? So you must see him for me, Charity. Will you?" "Yes." "Tell him, I don't know what you can tell him. Ask him not to think too badly of me. Tell him that if I ever cared for anyone at all, it was for him." "Will you tell him that?" "Yes." "Promise me on your word of honor." "My word of honor." Someone tapped at the door, and Myrtle caught her breath on a frightened gasp. "You must go now. That's Mother. She's nervous about me." She laughed hysterically. "Poor Mother. She believes even now I'm capable of running away. Give me my gloves." Charity saw how she was shaking, and with passionate pity and impulse, she went to her again, and putting her arms round her very gently, kissed her. "Always help you if I can, always," she said. "Thank you." Charity waited to ask one last question. "But when shall I do what you said? He asked me to meet him tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock near the Peter Pan statue in Kensington Gardens. We used to meet there before. She could not go on, but at last, when she found her voice again, "You must go instead of me, Charity. Anyone will tell you where it is. Now, run away." Charity almost fell over her aunt on the threshold. Mrs. Atfield asked an agitated question. "Is it all right? Is Myrtle all right?" "Yes." Charity could not trust herself to say any more. She went downstairs and joined the crowd that was overflowing out into the road and garden. The rain had stopped, and pale sunshine was flooding the world. "I'm glad the sun is shining. Glad," Charity told herself passionately. Surely, it must be a sign of some little happiness to come, she thought. There was a short delay. Then Myrtle came downstairs. She was laughing and perfectly self-possessed as she left the house on her husband's arm. "Don't they make a splendid pair?" someone said. Charity did not know what to think. She could not believe that only a few moments ago Myrtle had sobbed and cried so broken-heartedly. There was a lot of laughter and cheering, showers of confetti and little silver shoes. Then the magnificent car, a gift from the bridegroom, glided silently away, and Myrtle was safely married. Charity went back to the house feeling that she wanted to cry. Myrtle's tears had swept away the last glamour of romance with which the wedding had been vested. She felt really unhappy as she stood looking around the disordered rooms. There was only one ray of sunshine. Tomorrow, by the Peter Pan statue in Kensington Gardens, she would see Hugh Heather again. And that is the end of Chapter 8 of Charities Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day.